Loot. Everyone loves loot, right? There's nothing like seeing a new shiny off in the distance, closing in on an elaborately decorated treasure chest, or simply seeing a sprinkling of goodies pop out of an enemy as you defeat them. Problem is, creating a loot system isn't as simple as just throwing loot out there and calling it good. Creating a worthwhile loot system is a difficult process of balance. The most common loot system that's in right now is definitely the randomized loot system, like what's in Destiny or Borderlands, etc. In such systems, loot is randomized and scaled, meaning you can find the same weapon with scaled stats based on its rarity and other various factors. Unfortunately, these systems don't always work. What's more, they don't mesh well at all with more skill-based, kinetic action combat systems, and yet that's usually what they're found in most commonly. For the record, they don't always work in more strategic, menu-driven systems either, but at least these two facets of design can click together fairly easily. The thing is though, in an action-oriented game, such loot design is completely at odds with the mechanics the player has control over, and I've never really seen it not end up with one or more of the following three issues. With such a system, players can often either find sections of the game suddenly far too difficult, or too easy based entirely on getting lucky or unlucky with loot drops. When you're the one entirely in control of your character, and your skill with these controls is what's primarily intended to dictate the outcome of a battle, it feels cheap if your randomly generated gear is what's holding you back. It can cause battles to become a war of attrition rather than a challenge of mechanics. Meanwhile, on the flip side, if you get particularly strong loot drops, it can destroy any semblance of challenge at all, simply because your DPS, or defense, or whatever else is too high. Based on the previous issue, this can end up with the player having very little control over how they play through an area, even possibly requiring that they exploit issues to move forward. What's more, it can lead to them being forced to grind to get further. Sure, the Souls games can feel like you're required to grind to progress, but you never really are. There isn't a logical build that I've ever seen that couldn't best 99% of the challenges in a Souls game with a properly skilled player at the helm. Randomly scaled loot can unbalance that, and lets luck play a bigger role. At that point, what's often the only way for the player to rebalance that scale? Grinding. Plus, there's significantly less planning that can be involved in subsequent playthroughs, with players instead ending up reaching roadblocks for little reason other than luck. They can no longer plan playthroughs around getting so-and-so shield as early as possible. If that shield is only dropped by a certain enemy, and only 1 out of every 10 of those shields dropped has the defense or the ability or whatever the player wants. All of this is to say that the excess of options randomized loot provides on the surface can actually restrict player choice. In games like Spelunky, this works because loot doesn't have stats, and the whole game is designed around iterating on death. Only the best of the best are expected to succeed in Spelunky in the first place, meaning the randomized loot drives creativity instead of stifling it. But in a game like Borderlands, continually finding shotguns that can't make up for their lack of accuracy with huge damage output inherently limits options. My shotgun simply can't do enough damage, so I have to use another type of gun. Unfortunately, developers rarely use but two different solutions to fix these issues. The first solution is to severely limit the scalability of said randomized loot. If the difference between the best katana in a scale and the worst is only 10 damage when you're doing an average of 350 damage per second, there's little need to have the best katana over the worst. The boost doesn't offer much benefit, but at this point you have to ask why such randomized scalability even exists. If it doesn't impact the gameplay, why is it there? This is probably the better of the two solutions though, and we'll go into a few examples that kind of use this a bit later. The other option involves dumbing things down to ensure that the player never has to grind, even if all they have is bottom tier loot. This is the approach used by turn-based JRPGs quite often for their stats in general, as a way to ensure that players can get through dungeons while still being within a fairly large level range. They dumb down and homogenize encounters / difficulty in order to ensure that the player can get through an area with as wide of a range of MP levels, HP levels, ability options, etc. as possible. All the while, using these random battles is really nothing but preparation for the boss ahead. In other words, developers can end up in a catch-22 situation where they end up designing most encounters to be nothing but fodder for superficially preparing your character through their stats, rather than preparing the player through teaching them skills they may need. It means more of your time is spent doing busy work, and those that get good drops will find things far too easy. This can really stunt players' skill, because if they get enough lucky loot drops, they may ignore learning / developing skills early on that become paramount to success later on. Suddenly you're 20 hours into the game and it expects you to be able to manage stamina and parry like a pro for this one boss, but you never learned how because you had this uber flame burge and holy armor carrying you along the whole way. In the end, you either leave players who want a challenge out in the cold by balancing for the bottom tier loot drops, or you're way too punishing towards your players who want an easier time, since you balance for mid or even top tier drops. You're then left with the same question as with the first solution. Why have any tiers in the drops? Why scale anything in the first place? There's also the fact that a system like this can actually diminish the rush you gain by collecting loot, rather than heighten it as intended. It doesn't always, and if used well, it can be just as effective as pre-scripted or non-scaling loot. But depending on the way the loot system is framed, drop rates, the amount of items, aesthetics and presentation of the items, etc., it can sometimes make loot you find significantly less interesting than it otherwise would be. Sometimes it's worth infinitely more to a player when they find a single, pre-placed ring that boosts your iframes during a roll or something, than it is to find your 30th ring that boosts iframes that just so happens to be 10% more effective than the 29 other identical rings you already found. I personally would always rather see interesting loot with interesting quirks rather than just more loot and higher numbers. 99% of the guns I pick up in Borderlands or Destiny or The Division don't matter. They're not interesting, they're just a waste of my time when I get back and have to sell it all. The more loot I find with benefits that don't change the way I play, the more time I'm wasting in menus, sifting through junk I don't need. And grinding for a unique item dropped by an enemy is very different from grinding for an item you have a bunch of, but the one that you want is slightly stronger than what you have. Basically, it comes down to this. If the scalability of the random loot is significant enough in an action game to make a large difference, it usually upsets the balance of the game and contradicts the rest of the more kinetic mechanical design, which is exactly why these sorts of systems are usually used in more menu-driven or turn-based games instead. Again though, you can still have the problem there. But if it doesn't make a significant enough difference, it has no real reason to be included in the first place most of the time, since it doesn't really impact anything. As a developer, you end up stuck between a rock and a hard place, where the only real solution I've ever seen that makes sense is to simply remove the scaling random loot drops. Don't get me wrong, there may be enough other mechanics at play to balance this out. Small, player-driven, open-ended mechanics like these can really add unfathomable amounts of life to a game. But I more often than not see random loot scaling ruin a lot of otherwise fantastic games, because the developers don't realize how much it fights with the other mechanics they're using. An example of a game using these sorts of systems in an adequate manner would be Bloodborne, with blood gems. Blood gems do nothing but boost equipment power and maybe change their damage type. But first of all, the amount of change they offer is rarely that big until way late in the post-game. It skirts dangerously close by the why have it in the first place problem. But what helps this a bit is that the blood gems are a completely optional part of the system, meaning whether they make a big difference or not matters a little less. They serve as a buffer that usually only offers a net gain in use. And even still, this lack of impact can leave finding randomly dropped blood gems rather boring, and even tedious when you later have to sift through all of them to find the ones you want to keep. One alternative solution is to focus randomized loot on abilities and mechanics instead of stats. This can still limit players in a way. If you continually find shields that explode into an AoE attack that damages nearby enemies when they're depleted, the player is either forced to ignore this ability and let it go to waste, or you're forced to find a way to use it, which may go against the way you want to play in the first place. But if you ask me, simply letting players ignore the shield's abilities, similar to blood gems, is superior to being forced to work around constantly dropping shields that just have really low defensive stats or something, because you can't find a good one. One asks the player to rely on skill, and uses these optional abilities as a buffer, the other asks them to grind. This is why, as far as the alpha and the beta of Neo seem to suggest, that game works rather well with random scaled loot. Damage values both from enemies and from the player are so high already that the only thing that will get you through a tough spot is skill. Again, these stats serve a secondary role as a buffer to help less skilled players. They're a passive net gain, meaning you don't need them to succeed, and only extremely poor management of them will lead to detrimental effects. But the point is, randomized abilities instead of randomized stats support skill-based kinetic design, as well as strategic non-kinetic design. Final Fantasy X was super smart in getting rid of statistical upgrades for weapons. Suddenly, instead of weapons being a linear upgrade system with little thought going into which weapon to use, hint hint, use the one with higher stats, duh, you instead have meaningful choices presented to you. Do you want to use the sword that does fire damage, or the one that halves your MP cost? Both are valuable, and both can stay relevant as you progress through the game. The same can be done in more kinetic experiences. The difference between a randomly dropped set of boots that allows you to double jump and one that allows you to sprint twice as fast is one worth contemplating. The difference between 10 extra damage really isn't. This sort of system still has the issue of needing to balance around players having none of these abilities. They're still balancing around the lowest common denominator. But as Mega Man proves, this can work well if you focus the design around skill-based actions, and treat these randomly dropping abilities as secondary benefits, rather than the crux of your design like a game like Destiny or The Division do. Going forward, I really do hope a lot more games decide to adopt systems that don't rely so much on pointless numbers. It's not that I'm against relying on stats to build a game. I'm against using these stats as a way to elongate games, or give players very temporary cheap highs that they could get otherwise with better designed mechanics. I'd be really disappointed if all of the future games that I play started to rely on finding one specific version of a gun that makes me slightly more powerful so that I can suddenly take on a raid boss. If that's the case, I'm just gonna stick with the games I've been playing. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you're interested in another one, here's the last one that I uploaded. You can also follow me on Twitter or subscribe by hitting the subscribe button.